Story number 11. Molly was the only little girl on her street. But when she was 8 years old, another girl came to live in the house opposite hers. The new girl was 8 years old too, and her name was Joan. Joan had 2 brothers. She didn't go to the same school as Molly, but they soon began to play together after school. One day Joan came home, had her milk and cookies, and then went to Molly's house. She said to her friend, "Hi, Molly. Will you come to my house to play? I've got a nice new game." Molly answered, "I'm sorry, Joan, but my mother won't let me play with you today because your brother George has a bad cold and she doesn't want me to get it too." "Oh, that's all right, Molly," Joan answered quickly. "George isn't really my brother. He's my stepbrother."
Now answer these questions. 1. When did Joan come to live on the same street as Molly? 2. Did Molly and Joan play together at school? 3. When did they play together? 4. Who was George? 5. Why didn't Molly's mother want her to play with Joan one day? 6. What did Joan say when Molly told her this? Story number 12. Mike was a small boy, and he hated soap and water. 3 or 4 times every day, his mother said to him, "Mike, your hands are very dirty again. Go and wash them." But Mike never really washed them well. He only put his hands in the water for a few seconds and then took them out again. Mike's uncle and aunt lived in another city. One day, they came to stay with Mike's parents, and they brought their small son, Ted, with them. Ted was a year younger than Mike, and he didn't like soap and water either. The boys sat with their parents for a few minutes, but then they went outside. When they were alone, Mike looked at Ted's hands and then said proudly, "My hands are dirtier than yours." "Of course they are," Ted answered angrily. "You're a year older than I am."
Now answer these questions. 1. What did Mike do when his mother said, "Go and wash your hands"? 2. Who visited Mike's parents one day? 3. Who did they bring with them? 4. What did Mike do when the 2 boys were alone? 5. What did he say to Ted? 6. What did Ted answer? Story number 13. Peter was 10 years old. One day his friend Paul said to him, "I'm going to have a birthday party on Saturday, Peter. Can you come?" Peter asked his mother, and she said, "Yes, you can go." She phoned Paul's mother to tell her. Before Peter went to the party on Saturday afternoon, his mother said to him, "Now, Peter, don't forget to be polite. Don't ask for food. Wait until someone gives it to you." "All right, Mom," Peter answered, and he went to Paul's house on his bicycle. There were a lot of children at the party. They played together for an hour, and then Paul's mother gave them some food. But she forgot to give Peter any. He waited politely for a few minutes, and then he held his plate up in the air and said loudly, "Does anyone want a nice clean plate?"
Now answer these questions. 1. What did Paul invite Peter to? 2. What did Peter's mother say to him before he went? 3. How did Peter go to the party? 4. What did Paul's mother forget to do? 5. What did Peter do and then say? Story number 14. Nora was 16 years old. She had a little brother. Her brother's name was Jim. Jim was sometimes naughty, but he made Nora laugh a lot, and she loved him and was always very nice to him. One afternoon, she was walking from her house to the store when she saw a small boy running along the street towards her. He was going very fast. When he came near her, she was surprised to see it was Jim. "Hi, Jim," Nora shouted to him. "Why are you running like that?" Jim didn't stop, but he waved to his sister and shouted, "I'm trying to stop two boys from fighting." Nora was surprised again. She laughed and said, "That's an important job for a little boy, isn't it? You don't do things like that very often. Who are the two boys?" "They're Tom and me," answered Jim, as he continued running down the street very quickly.
Now answer these questions. 1. What was Jim like? 2. How did Nora feel about him? 3. What was Jim doing when she saw him in the street? 4. What did she say to him? 5. What did he answer? 6. Which boys was he trying to stop from fighting? Story number 15. Hank lived in a small town, but then he got a job in a big city and moved there with his wife and his 2 children. On the first Saturday in their new home, Hank took his new red car out of the garage and was washing it when a neighbor came by. When he saw Hank's new car, the neighbor stopped and looked at it for a minute. Then Hank turned and saw him. The neighbor said, "That's a nice car. Is it yours?" "Sometimes," Hank answered. The neighbor was surprised. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you mean?" "Well," answered Hank slowly, "when there's a party in town, it belongs to my daughter Jane. When there's a football game somewhere, it belongs to my son Joe. When I've washed it and it looks really nice and clean, it belongs to my wife. And when it needs gas, it's mine."
Now answer these questions. 1. What was Hank doing when the neighbor stopped outside his house? 2. What did he say to Hank? 3. When did the car belong to Hank's daughter? 4. When did it belong to his son? 5. When did it belong to his wife? 6. And when did it belong to Hank? Story number 16. Alice was 23 years old, and she was a nurse at a big hospital. She was very kind, and all of her patients liked her very much. One day, she was out shopping when she saw an old woman waiting to cross a busy street. Alice wanted to cross the street too, so she went over to offer to help the woman across. When Alice was near her, she suddenly laughed and said, "Mrs. Herman, you were my patient in the hospital last year." Mrs. Herman was very pleased to see her. "I'll help you cross the street, Mrs. Herman," Alice said. "Oh, thank you very much, Alice," Mrs. Herman said, and she stepped forward. "No, no, Mrs. Herman," Alice said quickly. "Wait, the light's still red." "Oh," Mrs. Herman answered as she stepped back. "I can easily cross the street alone when the light's green."
Now answer these questions. 1. Why did Alice's patients like her? 2. Who was Mrs. Herman? 3. What did Alice offer to do? 4. What did Mrs. Herman do then? 5. Why did Alice stop her? 6. What did Mrs. Herman say? Story number 17. John left the United States in 1969 to work in Africa. Africa was hot, and when John came back to the United States in 1979, he said to himself, "It's much colder here than it was before I left. I'm going to buy an electric heater. Also, everything is much more expensive." John went to a store the next day to buy an electric heater. The salesman showed him 3 or 4 different kinds and then said, "And this is our best electric heater. It costs a lot of money, but it saves half of your electricity, and electricity is very expensive now, isn't it?" "Yes, it's very expensive," John answered, "and it's becoming worse every year." He looked at the electric heater carefully, thought for a few seconds, and then said, "Well, I'll take 2 of these, please, and then I'll save all of my electricity."
Now answer these questions. 1. How long was John in Africa? 2. What did he want to buy when he came back? 3. What did the salesman show him? 4. What did the salesman say? 5. What did John answer? 6. Can the 2 heaters save all his electricity? Story number 18. Steve was 11 years old, and his brother Tim was 7. Both of them went to the same school, and both of them liked sports and games very much. They also liked fighting, but their mother wasn't happy when they had fights with other boys. A few days ago, Tim ran into the house and went up to his bedroom. His brother was there too, listening to their record player. He looked up when Tim came in and said, "Why are you crying, Tim?" "Because Harry hit me," his younger brother said. Harry was one of the boys at school, and they often had fights with each other. Steve laughed and said, "Did you hit him back? Or did you cry like a baby and run home to Mommy?" "I hit him back," Tim answered angrily. "I hit him back first, and then he hit me."
Now answer these questions. 1. What 3 things did Steve and Tim like? 2. When wasn't their mother happy? 3. Why was Tim crying when he came into the bedroom? 4. Who was Harry? 5. What did Steve ask Tim? 6. What did Tim answer? Story number 19. Billy lived on a quiet street in a big city. His mother sometimes took him to the park to play, but when she was busy, he played in the street. One evening, Billy's father gave him a beautiful new ball, and the next morning Billy went out into the street to play with it. He played happily for a few minutes, but then a big dog came along. When the dog saw the ball, he wanted to play with it too. Billy picked the ball up and held it above his head. He did not want the big dog to take it and run away with it, but the dog jumped up and knocked him over. Billy's mother came out of the house and ran to him at once. "Did he bite you?" she asked. "No, he didn't bite me," Billy answered, "but he tasted me."
Now answer these questions. 1. What was Billy doing when the dog came along? 2. What did the dog want to do? 3. What did Billy do then? 4. And what did the dog do? 5. What did Billy's mother ask him? 6. And what did Billy answer? Story number 20. Mr. and Mrs. Williams got married when he was 23 and she was 20. 25 years later, they had a big party, and a photographer came and took some photographs of them. Then the photographer gave Mrs. Williams a card and said, "They'll be ready next Wednesday. You can get them from our studio." "No," Mrs. Williams said, "please send them to us." The photographs arrived a week later, but Mrs. Williams was happy when she saw them. She got into her car and drove to the photographer's studio. She went inside and said angrily, "You took some photographs of me and my husband last week, but I'm not going to pay for them." "Oh, why not?" the photographer asked. "Because my husband looks like a monkey," Mrs. Williams said. "Well," the photographer answered, "that isn't our fault. Why didn't you think of that before you married him?"
Now answer these questions. 1. Who took photographs of Mr. and Mrs. Williams? 2. Where did Mrs. Williams go when she saw the photographs? 3. What did she say to the photographer? 4. Why didn't Mrs. Williams want to pay? 5. What did the photographer say to Mrs. Williams?